Imagine waking up in a dark, damp room with the smell of smoke and sweat heavy in the air. The sun has barely risen, but your workday is already calling you deep underground. No modern helmet, no electric lamps, no safety gear, just a flickering candle stuck to your hat with a lump of clay and a pickaxe that feels heavier than your own body. You are a medieval miner, and every single moment is a gamble between survival and tragedy. Mining in the Middle Ages was one of the most grueling and dangerous jobs imaginable. The earth could collapse without warning, poisonous gases could choke you silently, and even if you survived the day, your body paid a steep price: aching bones, damaged lungs, and a lifespan that was brutally short. And yet, thousands of men, women, and even children descended into the pits every day, drawn by the promise of wages, or forced by poverty, or pressed into labor by their lords. In this journey, we're going to explore what life was really like for these miners, their routines, their tools, the dangers they faced, the surprising role mining played in medieval society, and why most of us wouldn't last even a single day in their shoes. From the pitch-black tunnels of silver mines in Saxony to the sulfur pits near volcanoes, we'll uncover the untold stories of the people who clawed precious metals and stones from the earth at a terrible cost. Before we dive deep into this history, make sure to subscribe to History for Sleep, where we tell long, relaxing stories from the past to help you drift into rest. And while you're here, leave us a comment. What kind of history do you enjoy most, and when do you listen? Do you use these stories to fall asleep at night or to relax during the day? Your feedback helps guide what we explore next. Now settle in, find a comfortable spot, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow yourself to slip back in time. This is the story of why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval miner. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a mine entrance in medieval Europe. The air outside is brisk, perhaps damp with morning mist, but as you step closer to the wooden beams, shoring up the opening, you feel a different kind of cold drift outward. It isn't fresh air. It's stale, heavy, with the faint tang of earth and stone that has been trapped underground for centuries. The smell of sweat lingers near the entrance, mixed with the smoky scent of pitch torches and the metallic bite of iron tools that have been carried back and forth countless times. This is the miner's workplace, and the moment you step into that yawning darkness, you're leaving behind the world above. Your modern instincts might already start to rebel. The daylight fades quickly, replaced by an oppressive blackness that no natural human eye can penetrate. Today, we are accustomed to electric lamps, flashlights, and the assurance that a switch can flood any room with light. In a medieval mine, you had nothing of the sort. A single candle mounted to your hat with a lump of sticky clay, or an oil lamp with a weak flame, was all that kept you from stumbling blindly. The flame flickered with every movement, sending shadows leaping against the rough-hewn walls. It was dim at best, and if your flame went out, you were plunged into a darkness so complete it could drive a person to panic within minutes. As you descend further, the air changes. A faint dampness clings to your lungs. The walls are wet to the touch, slick with underground moisture that seeps through cracks in the stone. Drops of water echo from unseen places, falling into puddles with soft plunks. The ground beneath your boots is uneven, sometimes mud, sometimes rock, and always treacherous. You know, even without being told, that a single slip could leave you injured in a place where help is far away and limited. The tunnels are narrow, built not for comfort, but for necessity. Sometimes you must stoop low, your back bent as you shuffle forward. At other times, the passage is so tight that you feel the weight of the earth pressing on both shoulders. Claustrophobia is not a modern condition. It is timeless. And here, in the belly of the medieval earth, it would have been overwhelming for anyone unaccustomed to such confinement. Imagine hours of this, not minutes. Imagine an entire day without the relief of sunlight, breathing stale air, moving forward through a labyrinth of passages with only the dim light of fire to guide you. The sounds inside the mine are unlike those of any place above ground. You hear the distant clang of metal striking stone, the rhythmic tapping of pickaxes and hammers. These sounds travel strangely in the tunnels, echoing off the walls, sometimes seeming closer, sometimes far away. Voices, too, are distorted. A miner might call out to his companion, and the reply could come back in a way that makes it impossible to know which direction it came from. If you are not careful, it is easy to lose your sense of orientation. The labyrinth can become disorienting, and for newcomers, this confusion could spark fear. At times, silence falls. A candle flickers. The only sound is your own breath, heavy with exertion. In those moments, the weight of the mountain above feels more real than ever. You know that tons of rock and earth sit just above your head, and you are relying on crude wooden support beams cut from local forests, wedged into place to keep them from collapsing. There are cracks and groans, noises of shifting stone that remind you of how fragile your position is. The longer you stand there, the more you realize that this environment is not just alien to you, but hostile to human life. And yet, for medieval miners, it was routine. The descent itself could take many forms depending on the mine. In some places, miners dug sloping tunnels into hillsides, allowing them to walk downward gradually. In others, shafts plunged straight into the ground, requiring ladders or ropes to navigate. Wooden ladders slick with dampness were treacherous, and the simple act of climbing down or up could be deadly. Slipping from a rung might mean a broken leg, or worse, a fatal fall into darkness. Imagine climbing for minutes at a time, gripping rough wood, knowing that even this journey was perilous before you even began your shift of hard labor. For the modern mind, used to open spaces, clean air, and reliable light, the psychological impact of this first descent would be immense. Many of us would feel panic rising almost immediately. The lack of sunlight disrupts your body's natural rhythms. The stale air makes you feel as if you can't breathe deeply. The close walls induce a sense of being trapped. Add to this the knowledge that danger lurks in every shadow, the possibility of a cave-in, the chance of poisonous gas, the ever-present risk of injury, and it becomes clear why we wouldn't last a day. But for medieval miners, this was normal. They were born into families who had worked the mines for generations. Children grew up watching their fathers, uncles, and brothers disappear into the shafts each morning, returning at dusk with tired eyes and aching bodies. By the time a boy was old enough to follow, the fear was lessened by familiarity. It doesn't mean it was gone. Miners lived with fear every day, but they accepted it as part of life. Still, let's pause to reflect on what this first descent represents. It is more than just entering a tunnel. It is a passage into a world that most people of the time never saw. Farmers, merchants, priests, nobles, they lived their lives above ground, in sunlight, breathing fresh air. Miners crossed a threshold into an underworld of sorts, a place often associated with danger, spirits, and the unknown. In many cultures, the mine itself was seen as a kind of gateway to the realm of the dead. Myths and superstitions clung to the tunnels, and miners carried with them prayers and charms to ward off evil. The first descent was not only physical, but spiritual, a step into a liminal place where human beings were not meant to dwell. You standing at that entrance might feel your courage falter. One step into darkness feels like one step too many. Your candle flickers, your breath grows shallow, and your imagination fills the blackness with unseen threats. For medieval miners, there was no choice. They stepped forward, again and again, day after day, because their families depended on it. Survival was not just about escaping danger, but about enduring it. That endurance, more than anything, is why we modern listeners, lying comfortably in our beds, would never last a day in their world. When you imagine a miner at work today, you might picture hard hats, steel boots, electric drills, and heavy machinery. But the medieval miner had none of these comforts. His tools of the trade were shockingly simple, often handmade, and far more dangerous to use than the work itself already was. To step underground with this equipment was to carry the bare minimum of protection against the stubborn, unyielding earth. The miner's most important tool was his pickaxe. In the medieval period, pickaxes came in different forms, some with long, narrow heads designed to chip away at stone, others shorter and broader for breaking larger chunks. These were heavy, awkward instruments that required immense strength to wield hour after hour. The iron used for these picks was not always of the highest quality. Sometimes the tips would blunt quickly or even snap under stress, sending shards flying. The miner would pause, resharpen the edge on a whetstone, and return to pounding away at the rock face. Every swing echoed through the tunnels, every strike wearing down not just the stone, but the miner's body. Hammers and chisels were another vital pair. Miners would drive chisels into cracks in the rock, then pound them with hammers until chunks broke free. This was painstaking work. Imagine crouching in a narrow tunnel, your candle flickering above you, striking the same chisel again and again, waiting for the stone to give way. The hammer blows echoed like drum beats in the enclosed space, each strike sending vibrations up your arm until your bones ached. Blisters formed quickly, skin tore, and the iron handles grew slick with sweat. To widen cracks or split boulders, miners sometimes used wooden wedges. They would hammer the wedges into natural fractures and then pour water over them. As the wood absorbed the moisture, it expanded, slowly forcing the rock apart. It was clever, but it required patience. Sometimes it worked beautifully, splitting great chunks of stone loose. Other times, the rock was too stubborn, and the effort wasted precious hours of labor. And then there was fire setting, a method as ingenious as it was terrifying. When faced with an especially hard vein of rock, miners would stack piles of wood against it and set the timber alight. The fire burned hot, heating the rock until it cracked. Once cooled, miners could return with picks and chisels to pry the weakened stone away. This technique, however, filled the tunnels with smoke, consumed vast amounts of timber, and risked collapse. The very tool that allowed progress could also suffocate the workers who used it. Imagine standing in that cramped, smoky space, eyes watering, lungs burning, all to pry a little more metal from the earth. But perhaps the most fragile tool of all was light. A modern worker flips on a helmet lamp without a second thought. A medieval miner had only flame candles, oil lamps, or rushlights dipped in fat. A candle might be mounted to his hat with a lump of clay or carried in a small holder. Oil lamps, made of clay or metal, provided slightly longer-lasting flames, but they smoked and smelled. Rushlights, weeds soaked in tallow, burned quickly and dimly. No matter the method, the light was always weak, always at risk of blowing out. If a candle toppled or an oil lamp was spilled, darkness swallowed everything. Worse still, fire underground was dangerous in itself. Flames consumed precious oxygen, and in some places, flammable gases lurked. A miner's most basic necessity, light, was a hazard in disguise. Above ground, other tools played their part. Shovels, crude wheelbarrows, baskets woven from reeds or wood, all were used to haul the heavy ore upward. Children and women often carried baskets of rock to the surface, their backs bent beneath the weight. Ropes and pulleys groaned as loads were lifted, the fibers straining with each creak. The tools were simple, but the labor they demanded was endless. Protective gear, as we think of it, was non-existent. Helmets were not standard. A miner might wear only a wool cap. Gloves, if worn, were made of rough leather and offered little relief from constant blisters. Boots were simple and quickly worn through by the wet, uneven ground. Clothes grew damp and heavy in the underground air. Every miner went down into the earth vulnerable, his body the only shield against falling rock, sharp edges, and unseen hazards. It's worth imagining yourself holding these tools. A pickaxe that weighs 10 or 12 pounds doesn't sound so bad until you swing it hundreds of times in near darkness. A candle flame on your forehead seems quaint until you realize it barely lights your path and could sputter out with one wrong breath. A chisel and hammer seem manageable until you picture hours of crouching, your knees aching, your arms trembling, with nothing but rock dust filling your lungs. And yet, these tools were enough to extract the riches that Europe craved, silver to mint coins, tin to alloy with copper for bronze, lead for pipes, pewter, and shot, salt for food preservation, as valuable as gold in its time. Crude though they were, these tools fed kingdoms and empires. They built cathedrals, armed soldiers, and preserved harvests. The miner, equipped with only the simplest instruments, sustained a continent. For us today, it's almost inconceivable. Stripped of modern machinery, we would tire within an hour, blister within a day, and injure ourselves within a week. Yet medieval miners lived by these tools, generation after generation. They sharpened them, repaired them, passed them down, and wielded them with a kind of grim familiarity. Each pick, hammer, and wedge was not just a piece of metal or wood. It was the thin edge of survival against the unyielding earth. The life of a medieval miner was not just defined by the hours spent underground, but also by the rhythm of the day from dawn to dusk. Unlike modern workers, who might separate their work from their home life, the miner carried the weight of his labor from morning until night. His body, his meals, even his prayers were shaped by the mine. To understand why you wouldn't last a day in his world, it helps to walk through an ordinary routine, hour by hour. The day often began before sunrise. In a small wooden house near the mine, a miner stirred awake. The bed was little more than straw and cloth, often shared with family members for warmth. The first light of day crept through gaps in the walls, but the miner's work did not wait for sunshine. He rose stiffly, his body aching from the previous day's toil. Every joint reminded him of yesterday's swings of the pickaxe. Breakfast was simple and heavy, designed to fuel hours of exertion. Bread, coarse and dark, was the staple. It might be eaten with a slab of cheese, a bit of salted meat, or a porridge made of oats. Beer, watered down but nourishing, was often consumed instead of water, since the risk of contaminated wells was high. The miner ate quickly, sometimes in silence, sometimes with a brief exchange of words with his wife or children. If his children were old enough, they might accompany him to the mine. Work was not limited to grown men. Families shared the burden. Before leaving, many miners prayed. The mine was dangerous, and superstition mixed freely with faith. A simple sign of the cross, a muttered invocation to a patron saint, or even a whispered charm might be uttered before stepping out the door. Some kissed religious medallions or small tokens for luck. Every miner knew someone who had gone down into the mine and not come back. Faith, whether in God or in charms, was one of the few comforts available. The walk to the mine was often short, for miners lived in small communities built around the pits and shafts. Along the way, he joined other men, some chatting, some quiet. The air above ground was fresh, but the looming entrance of the mine awaited them, a reminder of the day's coming hardship. Wooden supports framed the black opening, and a few torches flickered nearby. The miner adjusted his tool's pickaxe slung over the shoulder, chisel tucked at the belt, a candle ready for use. The day was about to begin. Once inside, the hours blurred. The miner's tasks depended on his role. Some worked at the rock face, chipping and hammering at the stubborn stone. Others hauled baskets of ore, stooped low to carry heavy loads through twisting tunnels. Younger boys often worked as trappers, responsible for holding candles or opening and closing small wooden doors to direct airflow. Each role was exhausting in its own way. The routine underground was relentless. Swing, strike, break, haul. Rest was brief, often just a pause to drink from a small flask of beer or water. Food was rarely eaten below, but if it was, it consisted of bread or dried meat carried in a pouch. The underground air was damp and foul. Eating there was unpleasant. Still, hunger often won out. The hours dragged on, measured not by clocks, but by aching muscles and dwindling candles. Time underground had a strange quality. Without sunlight, the miner lost track of the day. He relied on the changing shifts or the habits of his companions to mark progress. A man could spend 10 or 12 hours in the tunnels, emerging at last with eyes blinking against the returning daylight. Above ground, the day did not end. The ore needed to be washed, sorted, and prepared. Families often joined in this work. Women and children stood by streams, rinsing stones to separate metal from earth. Others carried heavy buckets, stoked fires for smelting, or repaired tools. The miner himself might help with these tasks or collapse briefly before the cycle began again the next day. Meals in the evening were much like breakfast, simple, filling, and repetitive. Bread, pottage, cheese, and beer formed the staples. If the miner was fortunate, perhaps a stew of beans or cabbage simmered over the fire. Meat was rare and precious, usually saved for Sundays or festivals. Still, the food had one purpose: to keep the miner strong enough to return to work. In the evenings, the miner's body bore the cost of the day. His hands were blistered, his back sore, his lungs heavy from dust. Some might seek relief in the tavern, drinking with fellow workers, trading stories, and briefly forgetting their hardship. Others returned home to families, sharing a meal before collapsing onto their straw beds. And yet, even in exhaustion, the miner's mind lingered on the risks. He thought of the creaking timbers underground, of friends injured or killed, of debts owed to lords who owned the mine. His life was precarious, and the day's wage never seemed enough to offset the danger. Tomorrow, he would rise and repeat the same cycle, because there was no other choice. For us today, the miner's daily routine seems unbearable. To wake in pain, eat poorly, work in darkness, risk death, and return only to begin again, it is a rhythm that wears down the spirit as much as the body. But for the medieval miner, this was life. Normal, expected, and inescapable. It was a routine that demanded endurance most of us no longer possess, and it is one more reason why we would not last even a single day in his world. If the tools were crude and the routine exhausting, the greatest burden of all was the danger. The medieval mine was not only a place of darkness and toil, but also a place where the earth itself seemed to turn against its intruders. To enter the mine was to gamble with your life every single day, because at any moment the ground might shift, the air might vanish, or the tunnels might betray you. These dangers were not rare accidents. They were ever-present realities. The most terrifying of all was the cave-in. The rock and soil above a miner's head weighed thousands of tons, and the wooden supports meant to hold it up were little more than logs wedged into place. These beams cracked, splintered, and sagged under the relentless pressure. Sometimes a miner would hear a sharp snap, like a tree breaking in a storm. Then the earth roared, rushing down in an unstoppable avalanche of stone and soil. A collapse could kill instantly, burying men where they stood, their candles snuffed out in the blink of an eye. Survivors might claw at the debris, screaming for companions who never answered. Rescue was rare, for the mine itself became too unstable to re-enter. Families waited above, praying, but often received only grim silence. Beyond the threat of collapse, miners faced the invisible menace of bad air. Medieval men knew nothing of chemical gases, but they were intimately familiar with choke damp, the suffocating air that pooled in deep tunnels. Without ventilation shafts, oxygen was quickly consumed by candles and men alike. A miner might suddenly gasp for breath, his candle flickering low, and collapse without warning. Others spoke of fire-damp, explosive gases that could ignite from the very flames they carried for light. Though the science was unknown, the effect was deadly mysterious suffocations and sudden blasts that left tunnels charred and bodies broken. Water, too, was a constant adversary. Underground springs seeped into tunnels, pooling into slick puddles, or rising into floods. Miners dug trenches to drain it or hauled buckets endlessly upward, but still the water returned. A sudden breakthrough into a hidden pocket could send a torrent surging through the shaft, sweeping men off their feet. Drowning underground, in pitch darkness, was as terrifying as any collapse. And even when water did not kill, it weakened the mine's structure, rotting wooden supports and turning solid ground into treacherous mud. Then there were the falling rocks, small, sudden, but lethal. A careless strike of a pick could dislodge a shard that fell like a dagger. Stones rained down from cracks above, bruising flesh, breaking bones, and sometimes shattering skulls. Helmets did not exist, so even the smallest rock could prove fatal. Miners learned to flinch at every sound, to move cautiously, but the earth was unpredictable. Dust and smoke filled the air with every strike, every fire setting, every collapse. The dust clung to lungs, choking men slowly. Smoke from underground fires lingered thick and acrid, stinging the eyes and burning the throat. Ventilation was almost non-existent, and miners coughed constantly, their breath ragged with each passing year. Few could escape the long-term effects, but in the moment, the smoke alone was enough to disorient and sicken. Add to this the danger of sheer exhaustion. In the dim light, men stumbled, tripped, and fell into pits. Ladders slick with moisture gave way beneath their feet. Ropes snapped, dropping loads or men into the abyss. A single misstep might mean a broken leg, and underground, a broken leg could be a death sentence. Few miners had access to physicians, and even fewer could afford treatment. Infection spread quickly, turning small wounds into fatal ones. Superstition grew naturally in such an environment. Miners spoke of kobolds' mischievous spirits, said to cause accidents or steal ore. Others swore they heard voices in the darkness, whispering just before disaster struck. Whether real or imagined, these fears reflected the truth. The mine was alive in its dangers. The earth shifted, groaned, and betrayed its invaders, and men could only hope to escape each day with their lives intact. For us, imagining these dangers from the safety of our beds is chilling enough. But to face them daily, without choice, requires a courage we can hardly comprehend. A modern worker would balk at the lack of safety equipment, the constant risk, the absence of rescue. For medieval miners, it was simply reality. They entered the mine knowing full well that it might be their last day, and they accepted that fate because survival above ground depended on the wealth drawn from below. This, perhaps more than anything, shows why you and I would not last a day. It is not only the physical demands, but the constant awareness of death pressing in from every direction. Imagine swinging your pickaxe, sweat dripping, lungs burning, while above you the beams groan and the rock shifts. Imagine breathing the damp, foul air, never certain if the next breath will fill your lungs or choke you. Imagine knowing that your life rests in the hands of timbers and chance. That was the miner's reality, day after day, year after year. The dangers of collapse, flooding, and bad air were immediate and dramatic. But there was another enemy in the mines, one quieter, slower, and in many ways just as deadly. It was the dust. Fine, choking particles that filled the air with every strike of a pick, every hammer blow against stone, every fire setting. You couldn't see it clearly in the flickering light, but you breathed it in all the same. Over hours, days, and years, this dust destroyed miners from the inside out. When you enter a medieval mine, the first thing you notice is the air. It feels heavy, damp, and stale. But beyond the moisture lies tiny fragments of stone and ore that float invisibly. Each breath pulls these particles into the lungs. A miner cannot avoid it. There are no masks, no filters, no brakes for clean air. Every swing of the pick releases more dust, a constant storm in the tunnels. Miners coughed as they worked, hacking between strikes, their chests rattling like old bellows. At first, it was just irritation, a scratch in the throat, a cough that lingered after a long shift. But as months passed, the damage deepened. The dust embedded itself in the lungs, scarring tissue, cutting off air. What we now call silicosis was common among miners. They did not have the words for it, but they knew its symptoms all too well. The endless cough, the wheezing breath, the fatigue that grew worse with each passing year. By the time a miner reached middle age, his lungs might already be failing. Many did not live long enough to see their hair turn gray. The body weakened in other ways too. Dust carried not only stone, but sometimes poisonous elements. Lead, arsenic, and sulfur clung to the air. Miners inhaled them unknowingly, poisoning their blood. Symptoms varied. Some suffered stomach pains, others trembled uncontrollably, some grew weak and pale. Poison seeped in silently, without warning, and often there was no cure. Families spoke of miners who wasted away, their bodies hollowed by unseen toxins. The dust also settled on skin, in eyes, and in wounds. Cuts from sharp rocks, already prone to infection, festered more quickly when filled with grit. Eyes burned constantly, vision blurred, and some miners went blind after years of irritation. Skin cracked and thickened, hands grew calloused beyond recognition, and every surface of the body bore the mine's mark. Above ground, the effects lingered. At home, the miner coughed through meals, spat blood into rags, and gasped for breath at night. Sleep was shallow, broken by choking fits. His family heard the rattling in his chest and knew what it meant. The mine had claimed him slowly, piece by piece. Wives and children sometimes followed the same path, for dust clung to clothes and hair, spreading into the household. Women who sorted ore above ground and children who carried loads were not spared. A miner's lifespan was short. While a farmer might live into his 60s, a miner often struggled to reach his 40s. Some died much younger, their bodies failing after only a decade of work. To be a miner was to trade years of life for daily wages, to surrender breath itself for the sake of survival. And yet, men continued. Poverty left no alternative. The mine fed their families, however briefly. A man coughing blood still went underground, because if he stopped, hunger would claim his children faster than the dust claimed him. There was no escape, no retirement plan, no healing cure. Only work, breath by breath, until the lungs failed altogether. For us today, accustomed to clean air, masks, and medical care, the thought of breathing such dust for even an hour is unbearable. Imagine lying down tonight in your bed, and instead of fresh air, every breath brings grit into your lungs. Imagine the cough that never leaves, the feeling that you can never take a full breath. Imagine knowing that each inhalation carries not life, but slow death. That was the miner's reality, every single day. This invisible danger, the dust in the air, was as lethal as any cave-in or flood. It did not strike suddenly, but it never stopped striking. It lingered in every corner, clinging to every breath, eroding miners from within. And that is why, even if you could survive the darkness, endure the tools, and dodge the cave-ins, you still would not last. The dust would find you, fill you, and shorten your days, just as it did for countless men who lived and died beneath the medieval earth. When we picture miners in the Middle Ages, we often imagine groups of men descending into shafts with picks and hammers. Yet the truth is that mining was never just men's work. It consumed entire families. Women and children played vital roles in the process, both underground and above, and their lives were bound to the same dangers and hardships. To truly understand why you would not last a day as a medieval miner, you must also see the work through the eyes of the smallest and most vulnerable who shared in the burden. Children were among the first to enter the mines. Boys as young as 6 or 7 might be sent underground to serve as helpers. They were small, their bodies nimble enough to crawl through passages that grown men could not fit. Their tasks might seem simple, holding candles for the workers, carrying small baskets of ore, or opening and closing trapdoors to direct airflow through the shafts. But even these duties were grueling. Imagine a child sitting alone in near darkness for hours, clutching a candle while men worked in the distance. The silence was oppressive, the fear constant. A candle could sputter and go out, leaving the child swallowed by blackness. For a grown man, this was terrifying. Imagine the terror for a child. As boys grew, they were tasked with carrying loads. They filled baskets with stones and staggered through the tunnels, their backs bent under the weight. Their hands blistered, their knees scraped raw on the rough ground. Many stumbled, spilling their burdens, only to be scolded or beaten for the mistake. Childhood, as we think of it today, hardly existed. For mining families, a child was another pair of hands to earn survival. Girls and women also bore a heavy share of the labor. While fewer women descended into the shafts, many worked tirelessly above ground. They hauled ore from the entrances, washed the rocks in streams to separate metal from waste, and sorted stones by hand. Their backs ached from lifting, their skin chapped from cold water and sharp fragments. In some regions, women also worked the smelting fires, tending furnaces where smoke and heat burned lungs and eyes. It was dirty, brutal labor, carried out in all weather. In certain places, women did work underground as well. Accounts from mining towns describe wives joining their husbands in the shafts, carrying ore or assisting in hauling. Sometimes necessity demanded it. If a man was injured or too poor to hire help, his family followed him into the earth. Even pregnant women were not spared. Their presence was so common that some medieval mining regulations included rules about women in the pits, showing that their contribution was acknowledged, though rarely valued. Families labored together, not out of choice, but of need. A miner's wage was rarely enough to support a household alone. Every member had to contribute. A boy carried stones. A girl washed ore. A mother hauled baskets. A father swung the pick. The entire family lived on the edge of survival, and the mine consumed their days. The toll on children and women was immense. Many children never grew to adulthood. Their bodies were too fragile for such strain, and disease, accidents, and exhaustion claimed them young. Those who survived bore scars and deformities from endless labor-crooked spines, twisted joints, lungs already failing before they turned 20. Women aged quickly, their hands cracked, their faces lined, their health broken by years of carrying, washing, and breathing smoke. Families were often left without fathers, and mothers carried on the same work alone, dragging their children into the same cycle. Yet despite the misery, there was also resilience. Families created small bonds of support. Mothers told stories to children as they worked above ground, softening the monotony. Women sang as they washed ore in rivers, their voices carrying across the labor camps. Boys learned the trade from their fathers, proud in small ways to be part of the work that sustained their homes. Even in suffering, there was a stubborn will to endure. Still, when you imagine yourself in their place, the truth is sobering. Could you send a child into a dark tunnel, armed with nothing but a candle? Could you haul baskets of stone with bare hands until your skin split and bled? Could you stand for hours in freezing water, sorting sharp stones while smoke stung your eyes? For us, it is unthinkable. For medieval mining families, it was daily life. This was the cruel reality. The mine did not just consume men. It consumed families. It pulled in the young before their childhood began, and broke women before their strength had faded. Every life in a mining town was bent toward the pit, and no one escaped its reach. For us today, that is perhaps the hardest part to imagine. Not only would we not last a day underground, but our children and loved ones would be pulled in with us, sharing the same dangers, the same exhaustion, the same fate. For all the sweat, danger, and sacrifice poured into the mines, one might imagine that miners were at least rewarded with generous wages. After all, their work produced the silver that fueled kingdoms, the salt that preserved food, and the metals that armed knights. Yet the reality could not be further from the truth. Medieval miners lived in a constant tension between backbreaking labor and meager pay, often finding themselves trapped in cycles of poverty that even death in the mines could not break. The typical miner did not own the resources he worked. The veins of silver, lead, tin, or salt belonged to lords, kings, bishops, or wealthy landholders. A miner was merely a tenant of the earth, granted temporary rights to dig, or else directly employed by those who owned the mines. His wages, if paid in coin, were modest at best. Records from across Europe show that miners might earn slightly more than agricultural laborers. But this advantage was quickly erased by the extreme dangers and the expenses tied to the trade. In many mining regions, wages were not even paid in coin. Instead, miners were compensated with a portion of the ore itself, or with credit redeemable only at the lord's stores. This meant a miner's income was controlled, restricted, and easily manipulated. He might work for weeks, only to find that his share of ore was worth less than expected, or that he was forced to purchase food, tools, and rent from the very same lord who owned the mine. Debt piled up quickly, binding miners and their families to the pits in a form of economic servitude. Tools themselves were costly. Picks wore down, chisels snapped, candles burned out. Miners had to replace these at their own expense, often through the company store or the mine's overseer. Each tool chipped away at their earnings. Even the clothing that wore thin in the damp tunnels had to be patched or replaced, draining what little coin remained. For families already balancing on the edge of hunger, these costs were devastating. Food, too, consumed much of a miner's wage. Mining towns, often located in remote mountainous regions, relied on imported grain, meat, and beer. Prices were high, and shortages common. A miner's pay might vanish in a single market visit, leaving his family to survive on coarse bread and thin pottage. The irony was cruel. The ore he pulled from the earth enriched distant lords and merchants, but left his own household barely scraping by. There were times when miners struck richer veins and briefly enjoyed better pay. Some regions, like the booming silver mines of Saxony in the late Middle Ages, saw miners granted privileges, guild memberships, and improved wages. Yet even in these rare cases, the wealth never matched the risk. The mine always took more than it gave. Miners lived under constant pressure. If production slowed, if ore prices dropped, if a shaft flooded, wages vanished. Stability was an illusion. Women and children, who worked tirelessly above ground, were rarely paid directly. Their labor was folded into the miner's earnings, unrecognized and undervalued. A mother might spend all day washing ore in icy streams, her hands raw and bleeding, yet see no coin for her work. A child might carry stones until his back bent, yet his effort was considered part of the household obligation, not a wage. Poverty was shared across the family, but recognition was not. The poverty of miners was visible in their homes. Small, crowded wooden huts clustered around the pits, with little comfort beyond a hearth and straw bedding. Clothes were patched and repatched until threadbare. Diets were plain and repetitive. Sickness spread easily in such cramped quarters, and with no spare wealth for medicine, families often lost children to fever or infection. Even in regions where mining wealth built cathedrals, castles, and towns of stone, the miners themselves remained in wooden shacks, forever excluded from the prosperity they fueled. Perhaps the cruelest aspect was that poverty outlasted the miner himself. If a man died in a collapse or from disease, his debts to the mine's owner did not vanish. They fell upon his widow and children, binding them to the same labor that had already claimed him. Entire generations could be trapped in this cycle. A boy born in a mining town had little choice but to follow his father underground, his fate sealed before he ever picked up a tool. For us today, accustomed to wages, rights, and at least some form of worker protection, the imbalance is staggering. To risk life and limb for barely enough to survive is unthinkable. Imagine spending 12 hours in darkness, your lungs filling with dust, your back screaming with pain, and emerging into daylight with just enough pay to buy bread and beer for the night. Imagine knowing that tomorrow you must return, because without it, your family starves. This relentless poverty was another reason why few miners ever escaped their lot. The mine consumed not only their health, but also their hope. Each coin earned slipped quickly through their fingers, claimed by rent, food, tools, and debt. Survival was always temporary, and security was a dream beyond reach. So when you picture the life of a medieval miner, remember this: the danger of collapse and dust was only part of the struggle. The greater weight was poverty itself, pressing down as heavily as the earth above their heads. And this burden, just as much as the rock and the dust, is why most of us would not last even a single day in their world. The miner's sweat, the miner's blood, the miner's shortened life, all of it fed the wealth of others. For while the men, women, and children toiled in darkness, the lords above ground grew rich. Mining in the Middle Ages was rarely controlled by those who labored. It was commanded by kings, bishops, abbots, and nobles who owned the land, the rights to the ore, and often the very tools used to extract it. The story of medieval mining is not only about human endurance, but also about human exploitation. How the treasures of the earth flowed upward into the hands of the powerful, while the miners remained trapped below. In feudal Europe, land was everything, and so too was what lay beneath it. A lord who ruled a valley or mountain also ruled its veins of silver, copper, tin, or salt. Miners might be granted the right to dig, but this right came at a cost. They paid fees, taxes, and rents to the lord, cutting deep into already meager earnings. In some places, a portion of every load of ore, sometimes as much as a tenth, was taken as tribute. The miner had no choice. Without the lord's permission, his work was illegal and punishable by fines or worse. Royal charters often reinforced this power. Kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire issued decrees claiming ownership of certain metals, especially silver, which was vital for minting coins. In England, for instance, all silver and gold deposits technically belonged to the crown. Miners could work them, but the profit flowed to royal treasuries. Bishops, too, laid claim to mines, especially in lands owned by monasteries. An abbot might bless the miners before they descended, but he also collected the tithes from their labor. Even the church, so often a source of spiritual comfort, was another hand reaching into the miner's pocket. Some mining lords became fabulously wealthy. The silver mines of Saxony in the 15th century funded not only castles, but also universities and entire cities. The Bishop of Trent grew rich from the salt mines of his region, salt being as valuable as gold in its ability to preserve food. Nobles in Cornwall in England profited from tin mines that fed international trade. Yet for every coin minted, every jewel crafted, and every fortress built, countless miners bent their backs, their names forgotten. This imbalance was not lost on the miners themselves. Tensions often simmered between those underground and those who owned the rights above. Strikes and protests occasionally broke out, though they were dangerous acts. In the late Middle Ages, records describe miners in Saxony refusing to work unless their share of ore was increased, or unless dangerous shafts were repaired. Some succeeded briefly, forcing lords to make concessions, but most uprisings were crushed. The power of landowners was too great, and the miners had no wealth to sustain long resistance. Hunger always drove them back underground. What made the relationship even harsher was that lords not only demanded payment, but also controlled the infrastructure of mining towns. They built the smelting furnaces, owned the forges, and ran the markets. Miners were often forced to sell their ore at prices set by the lord or his officials, leaving them at a constant disadvantage. It was a cycle of dependency. The miner extracted the ore, the lord bought it cheaply, and then resold it at profit. The miner's labor fueled wealth he would never touch. Even religion was woven into this system of profit. Tithes were demanded from miners' wages, and offerings were expected when new veins were discovered. Priests blessed the mines, but blessings came with payments. In some regions, superstition and ritual became another means of control. A miner might be told that failing to pay the church's share would bring divine punishment upon the mine, dooming all who entered. Fear and faith bound miners as tightly as contracts and debts. The irony is sharp. Miners risked their lives every day, yet the wealth of their toil was most visible in the grand halls of lords, the glittering chalices of bishops, and the gleaming coins struck with the king's face. The miner himself lived in a wooden hut, eating coarse bread, his children barefoot in the mud. He might pass a castle on the horizon and know, deep down, that the stones of its walls were mortared with his suffering. For us today, the injustice is plain. To imagine working in darkness, only to see the fruits of that work paraded in gold-embroidered robes, or mounted on war horses, or ringing from cathedral bells, it is galling. And yet, for medieval miners, this was an accepted reality. The hierarchy of feudal society left little room for protest. The lord profited, the church profited, the crown profited, and the miner endured. And so, another reason you would not last a day, because you would know that the danger, the dust, the aching body, and the shortened life are not even for your own benefit. You would rise each morning, descend into darkness, and spend your strength so that someone else could dine richly, build proudly, and live long. For modern ears, used to fairness, however imperfect, it is a bitter truth. But for the medieval miner, it was simply life. To understand why medieval miners endured such misery, one must look to the treasures they sought. The earth in Europe was rich in resources, and the hunger for them was endless. Metals and minerals shaped kingdoms, fueled trade, and underpinned daily survival. Among these, none were more important than silver and salt. Silver glimmered with the promise of wealth, power, and prestige. Salt, though humble in appearance, was a necessity of life, as precious as gold in its own right. Both drew countless men underground, even at the cost of their health and lives. Silver, the metal of power. Silver was the lifeblood of medieval economies. Coins were struck from it, and coins in turn kept kingdoms moving. To a king, a bishop, or a lord, a silver mine was not just a vein in the earth, it was a vein of political strength. The Holy Roman Empire, England, and France all leaned heavily on silver to fund wars, build castles, and pay armies. Towns grew wealthy from nearby silver mines, their streets bustling with merchants who traded far beyond their borders. For miners, however, silver meant only more dangerous work. Silver veins often ran deep, requiring long shafts and narrow tunnels. Extraction demanded fire setting, chisel work, and constant hammering in hard stone. The deeper the mines went, the worse the air grew, and the greater the chance of collapse. And yet the demand never waned. If anything, it increased. Each coin struck by a mint bore testimony not only to royal power, but to the silent suffering of the men who dug the silver from the rock. Silver was also central to the church. Chalices, reliquaries, and ornamented crosses gleamed with it. Cathedrals sparkled with silver decorations, reflecting candlelight in shimmering brilliance. To the faithful, these objects were sacred. To the miner, they were the fruits of endless toil, carried upward from darkness into sanctity. The irony was sharp. The miner, coughing and weary, could rarely afford to place even a single coin in the offering box, yet his labor adorned the very altar. Salt. The white gold, if silver symbolized wealth and power, salt represented survival. In a world without refrigeration, salt preserved meat and fish, keeping food edible for months or even years. It flavored diets otherwise dominated by bland grains and vegetables. It was essential for feeding armies on campaign and sustaining towns during winters of scarcity. Without salt, medieval life would have been shorter, hungrier, and far more perilous. Salt mines dotted Europe, from the famous mines of Hallstatt in Austria to Wieliczka in Poland. Unlike silver, salt did not glitter in veins of rock. It appeared in thick crystals or brine-filled pools. Extraction often involved scraping great caverns underground, where the walls themselves seemed to gleam white in the flickering torchlight. The work was brutal in its own way. Dust from salt cut into skin, leaving wounds raw and painful. Brine burned the eyes and cracked the flesh of those who handled it daily. Men who labored in salt mines often looked prematurely aged, their skin lined and toughened by constant exposure. The wealth of salt was immense. Entire towns rose around its trade. In some regions, salt was taxed so heavily it became a symbol of oppression. In France, the infamous Gabelle tax on salt lasted for centuries, burdening peasants while enriching the crown. Merchants guarded salt routes as fiercely as gold caravans. Wars were fought, at least in part, for control of salt supplies. It is no exaggeration to say that salt was medieval Europe's white gold. Other resources, equally treasured, though silver and salt dominated, other minerals played their part. Lead was used in roofing cathedrals and in plumbing, though miners unknowingly poisoned themselves handling it. Copper fed artisans and smiths, tin was essential for bronze, and iron provided the foundation for weapons and tools. Each resource meant more shafts, more sweat, more lives lost in darkness. The contrast between value and suffering. It is tempting to imagine miners finding pride in the great role they played. After all, their work sustained kingdoms. And yet pride was scarce when bellies were empty. The resources they pulled from the ground brought little comfort to their families. Silver coins passed through their calloused hands only briefly before disappearing into taxes and debts. Salt, though vital, was sold far away at prices they could never afford. For us today, the disparity is striking. Imagine working until your hands bleed to dig silver that you will never wear, or salt that you can barely taste in your own meals. Imagine seeing the fruits of your labor transformed into coins that build castles you are forbidden to enter, or adorn cathedrals where you kneel in rags while nobles glitter in robes of silk. The wealth of the earth flowed upward, and the miner remained below, forever in shadow. Silver and salt, glittering and plain, together drove countless men into the earth. One promised riches for rulers, the other sustained life itself. But for the miners who clawed them from the dark, both were the same. Another burden, another risk, another reason why we today would not last even a day in their place. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself underground in a medieval mine. The air is heavy, the light dim, but what strikes you most is the sound. It is not silent down here, though silence lurks in every shadow. Instead, the mine is alive with noises, some familiar, some unsettling, all of them magnified by the closeness of the earth. The sounds of the underground defined the miner's world as much as darkness and dust, and they carried with them both comfort and terror. The most constant sound was the ringing of metal on stone. Pickaxes struck with a rhythm that seemed to echo forever, a sharp clang rebounding from the walls. Hammers pounded chisels with steady blows, each strike followed by the crack of rock, yielding a fragment of ore. These sounds, multiplied by dozens of men working at once, became a strange metallic chorus. To a new ear, it was overwhelming. To miners, it was the heartbeat of their world. Water added its own voice. Drops fell steadily from cracks in the ceiling, splashing into shallow pools. Small rivulets trickled down tunnel floors, their soft murmurs mingling with the harsh clang of tools. In wetter mines, the sound of water was louder, gushing into trenches, sloshing in buckets, pouring from one shaft to another. To miners, the sound of water was double-edged, sometimes a gentle companion in the dark, sometimes a warning of floods that could sweep them away. Voices filled the tunnels, but strangely. A shout from a companion did not travel clearly. It bent and warped through the passages, bouncing off stone until it seemed to come from every direction. Echoes confused the ear, making it hard to tell how far or near someone was. Laughter carried oddly, high and thin. A cough might sound like a groan from the depths. For men unaccustomed to the mines, this distorted chorus could be unsettling, as though the earth itself were speaking back to them. And then there were the sounds of collapse. The creak of timber supports as they strained under the weight. The ominous crack of splintering beams. The sudden, terrible roar as rock gave way and thundered down into the tunnels. Miners learned to listen for these warnings, their ears always alert for unnatural noises. A groan in the distance could send a shiver of fear down the spine, for it meant the mountain above was shifting, restless, and dangerous. Fire setting brought its own symphony. The roar of flames consuming wood, the snap and hiss as stone heated and cracked, the crash of rock breaking apart under stress. Afterward, the smoke settled with a muffled quiet, punctuated by coughing and wheezing. The sound of men struggling to breathe was as much a part of mining as the striking of tools. Silence itself was perhaps the most powerful sound of all. Imagine the moment when tools stopped, voices faded, and the mine grew still. The silence was not peaceful. It was oppressive, pressing on the ears like the weight of the earth itself. In that silence, every drip of water, every shuffle of a boot, every breath seemed deafening. For miners, silence often carried dread. It meant something had gone wrong, that companions had stopped working, that danger or death had arrived. Superstition made these sounds more haunting. Miners spoke of ghostly knocks, mysterious hammering that came from nowhere. Some believed these were the kobolds, underground spirits warning of danger or playing tricks. Others swore they heard voices whispering in the stone, or footsteps following in empty shafts. Whether born of imagination or the strange acoustics of tunnels, these sounds deepened the miners' fear. Even the smallest noises mattered. The sputter of a candle flame, for instance, was not just background, it was a signal. A flicker could mean bad air, warning miners that their next breath might be their last. The faint groan of rope on a pulley told of heavy loads rising. The creak of a ladder rung underfoot spoke of safety or the risk of collapse. To miners, ears were as important as eyes. Listening carefully could mean survival. Above ground, the sounds changed. Ore being tipped into carts rattled with a hollow clang. Women washing stones by rivers created the splash and swirl of water. Furnaces roared as bellows blew flames, and molten metal hissed when poured. The town around the mine was noisy with clatter, shouting, and song. But underground, the world of sound remained distinct, etched into the memory of those who worked there. For us, lying in comfort, these sounds are easy to imagine, but hard to endure. The endless clanging would drive many of us mad with repetition. The distorted echoes would unsettle the calmest mind. The sudden crack of timber or roar of rock would strike terror into the bravest heart. And the silence, thick, heavy, and filled with unseen threats, would be unbearable. The medieval miner lived in this soundscape day after day, his ears attuned to the language of stone, wood, and water. He knew which creak was harmless and which spelled doom. He could tell friend from foe in the dark by the sound of footsteps alone. The sounds of the underground were his constant companions, his warnings, and sometimes his undoing. And it is here again that we realize most of us would not last a day. Our nerves would fray, our ears would deceive us, and our hearts would falter. For the medieval miner, though, these sounds were life itself, the music of survival, played beneath the earth. A body that works 12 hours underground, swinging a pick, hauling baskets, or hammering chisels, must be fueled. Yet the miner's table was no banquet. It was simple, repetitive, and designed above all to keep hunger at bay. Food was fuel, not pleasure, and drink was often more important than the meal itself. The diet of a medieval miner reveals another layer of hardship, one that chipped away at strength as surely as dust chipped away at lungs. The miner's day began early, often before sunrise. His first meal was small but hearty, meant to give him energy for the long hours ahead. Bread was the foundation. Coarse, dark loaves made of rye or barley were most common, dense and heavy with grain. Wheat, the grain of the wealthy, was rare in mining towns. Alongside bread, there might be a smear of lard or butter, perhaps a slice of cheese if the family was fortunate. On rare days, he might add a piece of cured meat, salty and tough, but enough to strengthen him for the first descent. Beer, thin and weak by modern standards, was the usual drink. It was safer than water, which could carry disease. Even at breakfast, a miner might drink a small mug of ale, its calories and grains providing a boost. Stronger beer was saved for evenings, but watered-down brews were a staple from dawn to dusk. Food rarely accompanied men into the mine, for eating in darkness and dust was unpleasant. Still, some miners carried a pouch of bread or dried meat to chew during a short pause. Imagine crouching in a tunnel, candle flickering, dust settling on your food as you swallow it quickly, eager to return to work before the overseer noticed your rest. This was no leisurely meal. It was survival on the go. Drink underground was even more essential. Men carried small flasks of beer or water, though water was risky if it came from underground pools. The miner's throat grew raw from dust. His lips cracked. His body cried out for moisture. A few gulps of ale offered brief relief, though it was never enough to quench the deeper thirst of endless labor. The main meal came at day's end, when the miner returned to his family. It was not grand, but it was warm and filling. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables, was common. Into the pot went whatever the family had: cabbage, leeks, peas, onions, sometimes flavored with herbs or a bone for broth. Bread was served alongside, torn into hunks to dip in the stew. Meat was rare, reserved for Sundays, feast days, or when extra coin could be spared. Pork fat, however, was used often, lending flavor and calories to otherwise plain dishes. Eggs, cheese, and milk added variety when available. Fish might appear in regions near rivers, though salted fish was expensive. Still, the miner's diet remained plain-filling, yes, but monotonous. On fortunate days, a miner might taste something sweet, honey drizzled over bread, or dried fruit from a market. These were luxuries, not staples. For most meals, salt was the only seasoning, its precious crystals guarded carefully. Beer was constant, and not only for refreshment. It provided calories, nutrients, and hydration all at once. Children drank it, women drank it, miners relied on it. Stronger ales in the evening helped dull the aches of the day, numbing body and mind for a short while. In some regions, wine replaced beer, but always watered down, for pure wine was too costly. Water itself was complicated. Fresh streams near mining towns were often polluted by waste and runoff from ore washing. Drinking directly from them carried risks. Wells, too, could be tainted. Beer, boiled during brewing, was safer, and so it became the miner's lifeblood. Though filling, the diet lacked balance. Bread and pottage provided energy, but few of the vitamins needed to sustain long-term health. Miners grew thin despite eating heavily, their bodies burning through every calorie. Malnutrition weakened them, making lungs more vulnerable to dust, bones more prone to breaking, and wounds slower to heal. Families often went hungry in times of shortage, stretching thin porridge across too many bowls. Children, already frail from labor, suffered doubly from lack of nutrition. For some miners, the tavern offered respite. After a day's work, they might gather with companions to drink stronger beer, share stories, and forget their pain for a few hours. Singing, laughter, and fellowship softened the harshness of the day, even if only briefly. Yet even this came at a price. Wages vanished quickly at the tavern, leaving less for the family's table. Many wives cursed the alehouses, where miners squandered precious coin on drink instead of bread. Imagine yourself sitting at that evening meal. The bread is coarse and dense, the stew watery, flavored faintly with cabbage and salt. The only drink is a mug of ale, slightly sour, but the safest option available. After a day of crushing labor, it fills your stomach, but only just. Tomorrow you will eat the same, and the next day, and the next. Variety is rare, indulgence rarer still. Your body demands energy, but your diet barely provides it. For us, accustomed to variety, flavor, and nutrition, such meals would quickly wear us down. For the medieval miner, it was simply what life allowed. Food sustained, but never truly restored. Drink comforted, but never cured the deeper thirst. And so, even at the table, miners lived on the edge, nourished just enough to go back underground, never enough to escape the slow toll of hunger. For the medieval miner, the darkness underground was more than physical. It was spiritual, a place where the earth itself seemed alive with forces both benevolent and hostile. To descend into the mines was to enter a world of uncertainty, and so miners armed themselves, not only with picks and candles, but also with prayers, rituals, and charms. Religion and superstition wove through their lives, providing comfort, meaning, and sometimes fear. Before beginning a shift, many miners crossed themselves or whispered a prayer. Some invoked the protection of Saint Barbara, in particular, who is believed to shield men working with sudden death, especially from explosions and collapses. Shrines dedicated to her sometimes stood near mine entrances, small places where miners left offerings before stepping into the earth. Others prayed to local saints or asked priests to bless their tools. Even the act of lighting a candle might be accompanied by a muttered invocation, a way of calling light into a place of darkness. Yet religion alone was not enough. The mines had long been associated with spirits, and superstition was as strong as faith. In Germany and Central Europe, miners spoke often of kobolds, trickster spirits said to live underground. These beings were blamed for accidents, collapses, or tools gone missing. Some claimed the kobolds made knocking noises in the tunnel's strange hammering that could not be traced to human hands. If the sounds grew too persistent, miners might abandon a shaft altogether, believing it cursed. Other regions told of underground demons who lured men deeper into the earth. Whispers in the dark, shadows at the edge of candlelight, sudden chills in narrow tunnels. Such experiences were explained as signs of spirits at work. Some miners carried charms of iron or small crosses to ward them off. Others trusted in rituals, like leaving a small offering of bread or ale in the shaft to appease unseen forces. Whether these beliefs were true or not, they gave men a sense of control in a place where control was scarce. The church often tolerated these practices, even when they bordered on pagan tradition. Priests blessed mines before new tunnels were opened, sprinkling holy water at the entrance and chanting prayers. Masses were held to protect miners from sudden death. Yet alongside these holy rites, miners kept their own customs, whispering old words passed down from fathers to sons. Faith and superstition blended, each reinforcing the idea that survival underground required more than strength. It required protection from powers beyond the human world. Death in the mines was common, and funerals were a constant reminder of mortality. Miners gathered to bury their companions, carrying bodies out of shafts, and laying them to rest in the churchyard. Such scenes deepened the sense that their work brushed close to the realm of the dead. Some even believed that the souls of fallen miners lingered in the tunnels, warning the living of dangers to come. Whether viewed as saints, spirits, or restless ghosts, the unseen world was always near. Above ground, religion also shaped mining communities. Churches in mining towns were often funded by the very wealth that miners uncovered. Bells rang across valleys, paid for by silver dug from beneath. Priests wore robes embroidered with gold and silver thread, mined by men who could barely clothe their own children. For the miners, this created a strange duality. Their labor both honored God and trapped them in poverty. To see the wealth of their work displayed in churches was both a source of pride and a bitter reminder of their own suffering. Superstition lingered long after the workday ended. Children heard tales of kobolds at night, told as warnings to respect the dangers of the mines. Wives lit candles in their homes, praying that their husbands would return from the shafts unharmed. Mining towns lived under a shadow, where faith and fear intertwined. Every rumble of earth, every unexplained echo, every sudden gust of wind at a shaft's mouth seemed to carry a message from forces unseen. For us today, such beliefs might sound fanciful. Yet when you imagine the conditions' darkness, so deep it felt endless, silence broken by ghostly echoes, death a constant companion, it becomes easier to understand. In that environment, faith was not optional. It was survival of the spirit, a way to endure when reason alone could not banish fear. So when you picture yourself in the mines, remember this. It was not enough to have tools, food, or strength. You needed faith, superstition, and rituals to steady your heart. Without them, the mine's darkness would swallow not only your body, but your mind. And this, too, is why most of us would not last a single day in their world. When a miner emerged from the shafts, blinking in the daylight and gasping the cleaner air, his work was not over. In many ways, it had only changed form. What was torn from the earth in raw lumps of rock was not yet useful. It had to be sorted, washed, broken down, and smelted into metal. This labor fell on miners, their wives, their children, and often entire communities that revolved around the mine. The ground above was as much a workplace as the tunnels below, and it brought its own kind of exhaustion. The ore carried from the mines was mixed with stone, soil, and debris. Before it could be sold or smelted, it had to be separated. Women and children bent over streams and troughs of water, rinsing handfuls of crushed rock. Their fingers grew raw from the constant abrasion. Their backs ached from hours of bending. In winter, the water was bitterly cold, numbing their hands until they cracked and bled. Still, they washed, sifting patiently for flecks of silver, copper, or tin, knowing that each fragment meant survival. Others sorted ore by hand, crouching over piles of stone. They broke apart larger chunks with small hammers, seeking veins of metal within. The sound of hammering did not end at the mine entrance. It echoed through the yards above, mingling with the splashing of water and the crackle of fires. Dust rose here too, coating faces and clothing, settling into lungs. The air of a mining town was always heavy, carrying the scent of smoke, ash, and metal. Smelting was perhaps the most grueling of all above-ground tasks. Furnaces burned day and night, fueled by endless supplies of wood and charcoal. The heat was fierce, scorching skin, drying throats, and filling lungs with acrid smoke. Men and women worked the bellows, pumping air to keep fires hot enough to melt ore. Sparks flew, embers burned holes in clothing, and molten metal glowed with a dangerous beauty. One mistake, a slip, a spill, a sudden flare could leave burns for life. Even children were drawn into this labor. Small hands carried baskets of charcoal, fetched water, or sorted lighter stones. Few escaped work, for a family's survival depended on every member's contribution. Childhood in these towns was brief and bound to labor. Above ground, The dangers were less immediate than collapses or floods, but the toll was steady and harsh. The noise of this work carried across valleys. Mining towns rang with the sound of hammers, shovels, and roaring furnaces. Smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles. Travelers knew when they approached a mining settlement by the haze of soot and the constant clamor. These were not peaceful villages. They were places defined by ceaseless effort, where even the air and water bore the mark of industry. Life above ground was not only about work. It was also about survival in harsh conditions created by mining itself. Forests around mining towns were stripped bare, cut down to fuel the furnaces. This left landscapes scarred, rivers muddied with runoff, and soil eroded. Families who tried to farm near mines struggled with poor harvests. Bread was bought at high prices, firewood grew scarce, and water grew foul. In many ways, the miner's family paid twice, once with labor, and again with the loss of the land's natural bounty. Despite this, there were moments of community. Women washing ore often worked side by side, their voices rising in song to soften the monotony. Children played at the edges of the workyards, inventing games with stones and sticks between chores. Men at the furnaces swapped stories, laughed briefly, or shared mugs of ale to quench their thirst. These small human touches gave life to otherwise endless labor. Without them, the weight of work might have been unbearable. When the day ended, miners returned home weary not only from hours underground, but also from the endless duties above. The ore was not finished until it was ready for trade, and every stage demanded hands. There was no clean division between the mine and the home. Both were sites of toil. Families collapsed into sleep with smoke still in their lungs, their skin stained with soot and their muscles aching. For us today, the thought of such relentless labor is staggering. We might imagine that leaving the mine would bring relief, but for medieval miners and their families, daylight only revealed new tasks. To dig the ore was one trial. To prepare it was another. Work did not end when a miner left the shaft. It followed him, his wife, and his children until the day was done. And this, too, is why we would not last a day. We think of rest as a reward for effort, but in a medieval mining town, effort never ended. The ground above was as merciless as the ground below, demanding every ounce of strength from those who lived in its shadow. Mining was not only an occupation, it was the foundation of entire communities. Wherever ore was discovered, towns and villages sprang up, their streets, houses, and rhythms shaped by the demands of the mine. To walk through a medieval mining town was to see a place where every sound, every smell, and every life was bound to the earth beneath it. The first impression was one of noise and smoke. Furnaces roared, hammers clanged, carts rattled over uneven ground. From dawn until dusk, the town echoed with labor. Smoke from smelting fires hung low, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning charcoal and molten metal. Dust drifted through the streets, kicked up by boots and wagon wheels. Travelers often remarked that mining towns seemed to be cloaked in a perpetual haze, as though the earth itself exhaled through them. The houses were small, wooden, and crowded. Families of miners lived close to one another, their homes clustered near the shafts and smelting yards. Walls were thin, roofs patched with whatever materials were at hand, and inside, space was scarce. Straw beds were shared, clothes hung drying near the hearth, tools leaned in corners ready for use. Life was communal, noisy, and often cramped, but it reflected the constant closeness of work and family. The streets bustled with activity beyond the mines themselves. Women carried baskets of ore or firewood. Children chased one another between chores. Merchants shouted prices at stalls. Taverns stood at the heart of many mining settlements, their doors open to weary men seeking ale and company after a day of toil. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and laughter, songs rising as mugs clinked. Stories of the day's work were told and retold, tragedies shared, and for a few hours, the hardships of the mine were forgotten in fellowship. Markets thrived on the trade mining created. Merchants brought bread, cheese, salt fish, and ale to sell to miners' families. Blacksmiths sharpened picks and repaired hammers, charging dearly for their services. Some towns even attracted traveling traders who carried fabrics, spices, or trinkets, paid for in silver or copper ore. Though miners themselves rarely grew rich, their towns pulsed with commerce, driven by the wealth pulled from the ground. Social life in these towns reflected the harsh divide between those who labored and those who profited. Overseers, lords' representatives, and wealthy merchants lived in sturdier houses, often apart from the miners' huts. They walked the streets with better clothes, dined on richer food, and looked down on those who dug the ore. Tensions brewed, sometimes boiling over into disputes or riots when wages fell or rents rose too high. But more often, miners endured in silence, bound by necessity. Religion was woven deeply into town life. Churches stood prominently, often funded by mining wealth. Their bells rang across the settlement, calling miners and families to Mass. Inside, the contrast was stark, gleaming chalices and silver candlesticks, while many of the congregation knelt in worn, patched clothing. Yet faith offered comfort, and the churchyard became the place where miners were buried, their graves marked by simple stones, while the town's wealthier classes erected grander monuments. Festivals brought brief relief from labor. On saints' days or holidays, work paused, and the town came alive with music, dancing, and games. Ale flowed freely, songs filled the air, and for a short while, miners and their families celebrated life rather than endured it. These moments were precious, memories carried back into the darkness of the mines. Children looked forward to them. Wives prepared special foods, and men cherished the chance to laugh without fear pressing in. But hardships were never far. Poverty marked every corner. Families struggled with hunger when wages ran short. Illness spread quickly in crowded houses, and the smoke-filled air worsened coughs and fevers. Fires were a constant risk, for wooden homes and smelting furnaces stood side by side. Accidents underground reverberated through the town above, leaving widows and orphans to fend as best they could. A funeral procession, carrying another miner to rest, was as common as the laughter spilling from tavern doors. Still, there was resilience. Mining towns forged strong bonds among their people. Neighbors shared food when they could, tended one another's children, and gathered in times of grief. The danger of the mines bred a kind of solidarity. Every family knew loss. Every household lived close to ruin, and so they leaned on one another. This sense of shared endurance gave mining towns their spirit, rough and raw, but unbreakable. For us today, stepping into such a town would be overwhelming. The noise, the smoke, the closeness of life and labor would weigh heavily. The lack of comfort, the ever-present poverty, and the knowledge that every face you passed belonged to someone risking their life underground would make the place feel grim. And yet, for those who lived there, it was home, a world built around survival, community, and a stubborn will to endure. Mining towns were more than settlements. They were living reflections of the mines themselves, hard, noisy, dangerous, but also full of life. Above ground, as below, the miner's world left no room for ease. And this, too, shows us why we would not last a day, not only in the tunnels, but in the towns that rose around them. If the dangers of collapse, flooding, and dust threatened a miner's life in sudden ways, the toll of daily labor was slower, but no less destructive. The mine consumed not only years, but also bodies. Every strike of a pick, every load carried, every breath of dust carved away at health. To be a miner was to live in a body that grew old long before its time. A miner's back bore the heaviest burden. Day after day, men bent in cramped tunnels, shoulders stooped, spines twisted to fit the narrow rock passages. Hours spent hunched and straining warped the body, leaving men crooked, their backs permanently curved. Chronic pain was constant, a dull ache that never lifted, even in sleep. By middle age, many miners walked with limps or hunched shoulders, their bodies shaped by stone itself. Hands, too, told the story of labor. Blisters became calluses. Calluses split open into cracks, and fingers stiffened from endless hammering. Grip strength was prized, but it came at a cost. Joints swelled, arthritis set in early, and fingers curled into claws with age. Some miners lost digits entirely, crushed by falling rocks or caught in tools. Others lost sensation in their fingertips, nerves deadened by repeated trauma. The miners' hands were tools themselves, and like tools, they wore out. The lungs were perhaps the most fragile of all. Dust filled them daily, choking and scarring. The cough of a miner was distinctive, a rattling wheeze that echoed through taverns and homes alike. Breath came short, sleep was broken by fits of choking, and exertion grew harder with each passing year. Even those who escaped accidents underground rarely escaped this slow suffocation. To breathe was to labor. To labor was to die breath. Injuries were constant companions. A slip on a wet ladder, a rock falling from above, a misjudged swing of a hammer, all could wound. Without modern medicine, even small injuries turned dangerous. A cut could fester, a bruise could swell into infection, a broken bone could cripple for life. Some miners returned to work maimed, missing eyes or limbs, forced to adapt because their families still needed coin. Others never returned at all, their bodies failing in silence. Women and children who labored above ground wore down too. Backs bent from carrying heavy baskets, hands raw from washing ore, lungs burned from furnace smoke. Mothers aged quickly, their faces lined, their bodies frail before their time. Children carried scars from falls, burns from fires, and crooked spines from loads too heavy for their small frames. Whole families bore the visible marks of mining, their bodies reflections of the earth's cruelty. There was no retirement for miners. A man worked until he could not. Some managed lighter duties in their final years sorting stones, tending fires, or carrying messages, but most labored until their bodies gave out completely. Few lived to old age, and those who did were often broken, stooped and coughing, their strength long spent. Death came early, whether by accident, disease, or exhaustion. Even leisure offered little recovery. Taverns provided ale to dull pain, but the relief was temporary. Sleep, on straw beds in crowded homes, was restless, interrupted by coughing or the cries of children. There was no real rest, no true healing. The body was worn each day and mended only slightly at night, never enough to regain what was lost. For us today, the idea of such relentless wear is sobering. We expect to recover from exertion, to heal from injury, to live decades beyond our working years. For the medieval miner, the body was a tool with no guarantee of repair. Imagine waking each morning already in pain, shoulders stiff, lungs heavy, hands swollen, yet knowing you must go underground again. Imagine watching your children's bodies bend under loads, your wife's hands crack in icy water, your own breath shorten with each year. This is what mining did. It carved away health as surely as it carved stone. No miner left the trade unscathed. Some died quickly, others slowly, but all bore the marks of the earth. And this relentless wearing down of the body is yet another reason why most of us today would not last a day in their world. Across medieval Europe, certain regions became synonymous with mining. Their names carried weight in markets and courts, for the ores pulled from their ground fueled not only local economies, but entire kingdoms. The stories of these regions reveal both the riches of the earth and the tragedies that accompanied them. To speak of medieval mining is to speak of places where the soil itself seemed to dictate human destiny. In Saxony, in what is now Germany, Silver veins brought whole towns into existence. Freiburg became one of the most famous mining centers of the late Middle Ages, its hills honeycombed with shafts and tunnels. The silver taken from Saxon mines minted coins that traveled across Europe, enriching princes and bishops. The town grew wealthy, with guilds, churches, and schools rising alongside the pits. Yet the miners themselves remained poor, coughing and bent, their lives shortened even as their labor created prosperity above. Saxony's story was one of dazzling wealth built upon hidden suffering. Cornwall, in the far southwest of England, was known for its tin. Tin was vital for making bronze, and Cornwall's supplies fed markets far beyond England's shores. Mining there was so important that it shaped laws themselves. Special courts were established to govern disputes among miners, granting them privileges rarely seen elsewhere. Still, the work remained grueling, with shafts cut deep into the earth and men laboring in dangerous conditions. Legends of Cornwall's mines lingered long after, with tales of knockers, spirits said to warn or trick miners, woven into local folklore. Bohemia, now part of the Czech Republic, was another land rich in silver. The mines of Kutna Hora were among the most productive in Europe, rivaling even Saxony. Kings depended on Bohemian silver to fund wars and build cathedrals. The wealth of Kutna Hora was so great that its Cathedral of St. Barbara, patron saint of miners, still stands today as a monument to the town's mining heritage. But behind the grand stonework lay countless graves of miners who perished underground, their names lost even as their labor echoed in history. Salt, too, created its own centers of power. Wieliczka in Poland became legendary for its vast underground salt mines. These caverns stretched for miles, carved with chambers, chapels, and tunnels that still astonish visitors today. Salt from Wieliczka preserved food across Europe, earning it the name white gold. Yet for those who worked there, the mines were no less harsh. Dust-burned skin, brine-corroded wounds, and the endless labor left bodies frail. The grand halls carved into salt rock today are monuments not only to human ingenuity, but also to the countless unnamed miners who made them possible. Austria's Hallstatt region carried an even older tradition of salt mining, stretching back centuries before the Middle Ages. By medieval times, its reputation was firmly established. Entire communities revolved around the trade, their lives structured by the rhythms of brine extraction and salt carving. The wealth it brought was visible in the region's trade networks, but so too was the hardship etched into the miners' bodies. Mining stories also carried legend and myth. Some told of miners stumbling upon vast veins of ore that seemed endless, only for disaster to strike floods drowning tunnels, collapses sealing men inside. Others spoke of lucky strikes that turned poor villages into thriving towns overnight. The discovery of a new vein was cause for celebration, yet it also meant more men and children pressed into service, more families tethered to the demands of the earth. Tragedies were remembered in song and story. A collapse that killed dozens might be spoken of for generations, its victims remembered in local prayers. Fires underground, fed by timber and trapped air, sometimes raged uncontrollably, sealing tunnels forever. In some places, crosses were erected near mine entrances to honor the dead, simple markers of sacrifice. Even kings and nobles tied their legacies to mining. The riches of Saxony supported the rise of the Wettin dynasty. The salt of Wieliczka filled royal coffers in Poland. In Cornwall, tin shaped both local identity and international trade. These regions remind us that mining was not an isolated trade. It was the heartbeat of economies, the foundation of power, and the root of both glory and misery. For us, it is tempting to see only the splendor these regions produced, the cathedrals, the coins, the thriving markets. But behind every glittering chalice or minted silver piece lay the toil of men in darkness. Behind every castle wall funded by mining wealth lay the bones of those who worked themselves to death underground. The stories of these regions are, at their core, the stories of miners, forgotten, nameless, but essential. So when we speak of medieval mining regions, we do not only remember the riches. We remember the echoes of picks and stone, the smoke rising from smelting fires, and the lives bent beneath the earth. These are the true foundations of Europe's wealth, and they show once again why most of us would never endure even a day in their world. For centuries, miners fought the earth with little more than muscle and will. But over time, ingenuity began to creep into the trade. Slowly, often painfully slowly, technology improved. These changes did not make the work safe or easy, not by modern standards, but they offered small mercies, brief moments of relief, and the possibility of digging deeper and surviving longer. The story of medieval mining is not just one of endurance, but also of adaptation, as miners and lords alike sought new ways to conquer the challenges of the underground world. One of the greatest obstacles miners faced was water. Tunnels filled with it, shafts drowned in it, and countless lives were lost to sudden floods. Early on, men baled water by hand, bucket by bucket, hauled up with ropes. It was endless, exhausting labor. Eventually, miners harnessed wooden pumps powered by hand or tread wheels. Some pumps used a series of pistons, others simple chains of buckets that scooped water and dumped it upward, stage by stage. These contraptions were crude, but they kept tunnels dry enough to continue digging. Later, water wheels placed above ground turned massive pumps, harnessing rivers and streams to do work that once consumed human strength. Ventilation was another constant battle. In the deepest tunnels, air grew foul quickly. At first, miners relied on small wooden doors and shafts to guide air through the labyrinth. Boys were tasked with opening and closing these doors, channeling breezes from above. Over time, more sophisticated systems appeared. Vertical shafts acted as chimneys, drawing smoke upward and pulling fresh air down. In some regions, bellows were rigged to push air into tunnels, though their reach was limited. These systems never banished the dangers of choke damp or fire damp, but they gave miners a fighting chance against suffocation. Lighting, too, evolved in small ways. Candles remained common, but oil lamps became more refined, with designs that smoked less and burned longer. In some mines, reflective surfaces of polished metal were used to direct light into darker corners. Still, the glow was faint and fragile. Darkness remained a constant companion, broken only by flames that consumed both air and fuel. Tools themselves improved as blacksmiths refined their craft. Picks and chisels were forged from stronger iron, their edges sharper and more durable. Hammers grew better balanced, easier to wield. Wooden handles were shaped for firmer grip, though blisters still plagued every hand. Fire setting, a dangerous method of cracking stone with heat, was refined with better control of fuel and airflow, though the smoke it produced still choked the tunnels. Above ground, smelting saw important changes. Furnaces became hotter and more efficient, aided by improved bellows and the increasing use of water-powered hammers to crush ore. In some places, entire smelting complexes rose, where ore was processed on an industrial scale. These advances allowed more metal to be extracted from poorer quality stone, ensuring that even less promising veins could yield profit. Organization itself was a kind of technology. In Saxony and Bohemia, mining laws were written to regulate how shafts were dug, how profits were shared, and how disputes were resolved. Guilds of miners formed, offering mutual support and sometimes pushing for safer practices. These did not eliminate exploitation, but they gave structure to a chaotic and dangerous trade. In some towns, miners even enjoyed privileges unusual for their class, such as freedom of movement or exemption from certain taxes concessions granted by rulers eager to keep the ore flowing. Even with these improvements, the mine remained deadly. Pumps broke, shafts collapsed, gases pooled unseen. The new technologies were fragile and imperfect, often failing when most needed. A water wheel might drain a tunnel one day and shatter under strain the next. A ventilation shaft might guide fresh air until a shift in the wind left men gasping once more. Tools were sharper, but the stone was as stubborn as ever. For every small victory over nature, miners paid in blood and sweat. And yet, progress mattered. Each new pump, each better furnace, each law or guild rule was a step toward the modern industry that would come centuries later. Medieval miners, though trapped in hardship, were also innovators, pushing the limits of what could be done with wood, iron, and water. Their inventions did not save them from poverty or danger, but they laid the foundations for the mining revolutions that followed. For us today, these technologies seem primitive, almost quaint. But to a miner who once carried buckets of water by hand, a pump was salvation. To a man who coughed in smoke, a ventilation shaft was hope. To a town desperate for coin, a furnace that smelted more ore meant survival. These small mercies remind us that even in the harshest conditions, humans reached for improvement, however fragile. Still, none of these changes would make us last a day underground. A bucket chain pump could not save us from fear. A sharper pick could not shield us from collapse. A brighter lamp could not ease the suffocating darkness. Technology improved, yes, but the mine remained what it had always been, a place that devoured bodies and lives, no matter how clever the tools became. Though most medieval miners lived and died in poverty, their work reshaped Europe in profound ways. The metals and minerals they wrestled from the earth fueled kingdoms, built cities, and helped lay the foundation for the world that followed. Their legacy was written not only in the wealth of lords and kings, but also in the scars left on landscapes, the traditions of mining communities, and the cultural memory of a trade both feared and respected. The silver they dug minted coins that flowed through markets and courts, greasing the machinery of kingdoms. Monarchs built treasuries from it, financing wars and fortresses. Cathedrals glittered with chalices and reliquaries adorned in silver, their splendor a direct product of miners' labor. Without this metal, the medieval economy would have stalled. Money itself depended on it. Every coin exchanged in a market carried, invisibly, the sweat of a miner who had chipped it from dark stone. Salt, that humble yet essential mineral, preserved armies' rations and towns' food stores, allowing populations to grow and cities to thrive. Without salt, Europe could not have sustained itself. Regions rich in it grew powerful, their trade routes jealously guarded, their rulers enriched. Wieliczka in Poland, Hallstatt in Austria, and other salt towns became centers of commerce and culture, their mines central to European survival. The mining towns themselves left a cultural mark. Communities like Freiburg in Saxony or Kutna Hora in Bohemia became symbols of prosperity, their churches, and schools funded by the wealth of the ground. Though the miners lived in poverty, the towns flourished, drawing scholars, merchants, and artisans. Out of the darkness of the mines came the light of learning, art, and architecture. Even today, these towns bear the imprint of their mining past in stone streets and vaulted cathedrals. Mining also spurred technological change. Pumps, furnaces, ventilation systems, and legal structures born out of necessity in medieval mines paved the way for later industrial revolutions. The miners may not have enjoyed the fruits of these advances, but they were pioneers in adapting simple tools to immense challenges. The innovations of Saxon and Bohemian miners echoed centuries later in coal and iron mines that powered modern industry. The land itself carries the memory. Hills hollowed by tunnels, forests stripped for smelting fuel, rivers muddied by runoff all stand as silent witnesses to the intensity of medieval extraction. Entire landscapes were reshaped, sometimes permanently. Mining left behind not only towns but scars, flooded pits, collapsed shafts, and barren slopes. Nature bore the cost alongside the miners. The cultural imagination, too, was shaped by mining. Myths of kobolds, knockers, and spirits haunted Europe long after, blending into fairy tales and folklore. Saint Barbara became a universal patron of miners, her image carried in processions and prayers wherever ore was sought. Songs, chants, and stories passed down in mining families kept alive the memory of those who perished. Even in literature, mining became a metaphor for toil, danger, and the hidden forces of the earth. For all this, the miner himself rarely shared in the wealth he created. His legacy was not wealth, but endurance. He lived short, harsh lives, leaving behind children who often followed the same path. Yet without him, kings would have lacked coin, armies would have lacked weapons, towns would have lacked salt, and cathedrals would have lacked glittering adornment. The miner's legacy is hidden in plain sight, embedded in the very fabric of medieval society. Today, when we look back, it is easy to marvel at the treasures of the Middle Ages, the golden chalices, the shining coins, the salt that sustained empires. But behind every treasure was a man in darkness, coughing dust, swinging his pick in narrow tunnels. Behind every jewel was a family washing ore in icy water. Behind every fortress wall was the sweat of a miner who would never live to see it finished. This is the true legacy of medieval mining, a reminder that the foundations of wealth and power were built on the suffering of the many. It teaches us how human endurance can create wonders, but also how often those who endure are forgotten. For us, safe in our world of lights and comforts, it is hard to imagine lasting even a single day in that trade. But for centuries, miners did, and in doing so, they shaped the course of history. And so, we have walked through the world of the medieval miner, a world of darkness, danger, and endless toil. From the first descent into narrow shafts, to the clanging of tools in the underground, to the backbreaking work above ground, every moment of their lives was bound to the mine. The earth gave silver, salt, copper, tin, and lead, but it took health, years, and lives in return. We've seen how the dust scarred lungs, how the body wore down long before its time, and how families, wives, children, entire households were pulled into the same relentless cycle of labor. We've heard the sounds of the underground, the echoing clangs and whispered superstitions, and we've seen the smoke-filled towns built on ore and sweat. And we've seen who truly profited, kings, bishops, and lords who grew rich, while the miners themselves remained poor, coughing, bent, and forgotten. Yet their legacy is everywhere. Coins struck from their silver-fueled kingdoms. Salt-preserved armies and towns. Cathedrals shone with their labor, castles rose from their sacrifice, and whole regions thrived because they endured the mines. The miner's name may be lost, but his work remains, etched into the history of Europe. For us today, it is sobering to realize how little we would last in such conditions. One day underground would test our lungs, our nerves, our bodies, and our courage. Yet medieval miners did it day after day, year after year, until the mine claimed them. Their endurance is almost unimaginable from the comfort of our world. As we end this journey, let yourself rest. Let the noise of the picks and the roar of the furnaces fade into quiet. Let the weight of the earth lift from your thoughts. You are safe, warm, and free from that world of shadows. The story is theirs, but the peace of the present is yours. If you've enjoyed this long journey into the past, remember to subscribe to History for Sleep for more stories that help you drift into rest. Leave a comment and share what history you'd like to hear next, and tell us when you listen, at bedtime, during the day, or whenever you need a calm escape. Your ideas help guide where we travel through time together. For now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep take you gently, far away from the tunnels and the dust. Tomorrow, new stories await. Tonight, you can rest.